Good morning, everyone. Okay, so I've been reading John's Gospel, and I was over in John chapter 9 a few days ago, and this was when Jesus had healed a blind man, and he spat on the ground to make clay to heal his eyes, and there's something in there I saw. John chapter 9, starting in verse 1, now as Jesus passed by, he's passing by the temple gate here, probably, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Back in those days, they thought that if you had kind of an impairment, somebody had sinned to cause that, which, of course, that is not always the case. In fact, rarely is anymore. Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no man may work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay, and he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is this not he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him. And he said, no, I'm he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received sight. And they said, where is he? And he says, I don't know. So when this man first encountered Jesus, he couldn't see him. Then he comes back and he still can't see him, of course, because he's not there. So they're saying, where is he? Well, how should I know? I can't see him. Didn't know what he looked like at the time. But what struck me as I was reading this was the reaction of his neighbors, the people who saw him all the time. Some said, yeah, that's him. Others says, no, that can't be him. They didn't recognize him. So when I read that, I thought to myself, why didn't they recognize him? I mean, they've seen the guy. They pass by the temple all the time. And we're assuming he was the temple gate. This is a typical place where they would go. This was in Jerusalem. We know that because Jesus said, go wash in Siloam, which is right outside of Jerusalem. So we're assuming it was the temple gate, a typical place to beg. So they would have seen him over and over again. Some says, yeah, that's Joe, whatever his name was. Others say, no, that's not Joe, that's somebody else. So those who thought it may not be him, he was different. Something was different about him to the point they didn't even recognize the guy they had seen all these times. And that's what struck me. The man had an encounter with Jesus and he was changed. And it was a physical healing, of course, but this physical healing resulted later on, as we read, in a saving faith for him. And he was so changed that those who knew him didn't even recognize him. And when we are saved, a lot of times we are changed. Well, we are changed all the time. But when a person receives Jesus, the change might be, boom, a huge change. Other times, and for me it wasn't, it was a gradual change. And sometimes you can't even really tell, but something has indeed changed in a person. And over time, we will all be changed to be more like Christ. I remember when I was first saved, me and my friends loved to go to the local Christian bookstores over in Phoenix, and there were a bunch of them in those days. This is right after the Jesus movement and everything, and there was all these Christian bookstores, all this wonderful stuff. I remember seeing a poster of 3 steps of growth of a person who got saved. One was a little baby, and holding the baby's hand was apparently his big brother, who was more like a 10-year-old, and he had a Jesus shirt on, says one way, and holding his hand was a warrior in a Roman-style armor, as in Ephesians chapter 6 armor, showing the growth of a babe to a young person in Christ to a warrior in Christ. And our change would be one of those steps. Somewhere along there, we're all going to be changed. But we should be changed in our lives. Over in Romans chapter 6, verse 4, it talks about the change that will happen. It says, therefore, we were baptized with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should walk in newness of life. It's a walk, it's not a run. It's a continual change that we're going to have. I used to work at a place a long time ago, won't mention it much. But there was a fellow who's a believer there, was a friend of mine. And one time I was walking down the hall towards where his desk was, and I was just walking. I wasn't sneaking up on him or anything. And without even looking at me, he greeted me by name. And I said, "How did you know it was me?" And he said something that had a spiritual impact. He said, "I knew you by your walk." Do people know us by our walk? Do they know Jesus is in us by the way we walk? We should let people see Christ in us, that they would know him and us by our walk.